presidential primary season is heating up. While the drama on the Republican side is different in nature, the Democratic primary is, when you look closely, just as dramatic, and probably more important to pay attention to. A couple quick things to know here for context. Number one, the majority of Americans and Democrats don't think Joe Biden should run again, with a common reason cited being his cognitive fitness for office, as well as concerns about his age.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude, and he ran a bunch of bad boys.
Number two, the Democratic establishment has an entrenched interest and downright sleazy, disingenuous track record of denigrating, ignoring, or even sabotaging candidates that come from outside the establishment, or espouse policies that, while they're both sensible and incredibly popular with voters, and when I say that, I mean both Democrats and non-Democrats throughout America. In other words, highly electable candidates. Number three, there are two people running for the Democratic nomination against Joe Biden, against the wishes and efforts of the DNC. And at first glance, they're both pretty out there.
And appearing tonight live via astral projection is Marianne Williamson. Konnichiwa, girlfriend.
Maybe literally. Or at least that's what the media want you to think. And they're getting more and more desperate as both of these so-called fringe candidates make stronger and stronger showings in the polls. But I'm going to talk to you specifically about Marianne Williamson today, because she's potentially the most groundbreaking, revolutionary presidential candidate we've seen in the last several election cycles. With all respect to Bernie Sanders, who we are a big fan of here at the Animal Pill. Now, Marianne is a spiritual teacher and author by background, and I'll admit that even I was surprised when rumblings started about her being a serious candidate. Rumblings from the people who aren't beholden to the DNC, Democratic National Convention, and corporate media industrial complex. As she's clawed out airtime with the American people, it's become clear that she's whip smart, down to earth, has a personal ethic that she walks the talk in, and has consistent, genuine, authentic values. But the Democratic Party and the mainstream media don't care about that. In fact, it would actively work against their interests if a candidate like Marianne, or looking back to the last cycle, Bernie, was elected. Now let's look at a recent interview that Marianne Williamson had on MSNBC to see just how hostile and condescending the media establishment is right now in terms of their coverage of Williamson.
Williamson recently laid out what she calls an economic bill of rights, which runs to the left of President Biden's economic policies and includes the right to a job that pays a living wage and universal quality health care. But given she can't win, why is she running? Why are you running against Joe Biden? Why do you believe he does not deserve a second term as a Democratic president?
You said a couple of things tonight that were interesting. You said, well, he has given more investment in green energy in the Inflation Reduction Act than had ever been done. Yeah, but he also approved the Willow Project, which completely nullifies those investments. He's also given more oil drilling permits even than Trump did. So this idea that he's done more investment in green energy, please let's not pretend this is the great climate change president. You also mentioned that he cut child poverty in half. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, he did with the child tax credit. And guess what? 6 months after they did it, it expired and they didn't bother to permanentize it.
But yes, you are popular with younger voters and on TikTok. But you can't win a Democratic presidential primary. You're essentially a spoiler candidate. And so by primarying Biden, all you're doing is weakening him in the general and making it easier for a Republican to beat him in 2024 in what will be a very tight election.
Well, there are two things about what you said. First of all, you said I'm a spoiler candidate. I'm not a spoiler candidate. I'm running in a primary. So you can't be a spoiler if you're running in the primary. The second thing you said was this narrative you can't win. Isn't that what people said about Donald Trump? I will win if people vote for me. I believe that in a democracy, people should have as wide an array of options before them as there are candidates running on agendas. There is an ameliorative effect in somebody telling the truth. Somebody needs to tell the truth about this country, which the American people know. Please remember, Mehdi, 70% of the American people do not want him to run again. The American people, you have 70% of the American people who live with chronic economic anxiety.
So what are you proposing to do that's different to Joe Biden? Briefly explain to our viewers, what is your policy platform, briefly?
We should have universal health care. We should have free college tuition and tech school. We should have free child care. We should have paid family leave. We should have guaranteed sick pay, and we should have a guaranteed living wage.
I agree, Marianne, with your analysis, and I agree with a lot of the policies that you're outlining. The issue is, I guess, you. I mean, I may agree with a lot of your policies, But that doesn't mean that you, Marianne Williamson, self-help author, best-selling author, former spiritual advisor to Oprah Winfrey, are qualified to lead the country, to be commander-in-chief, to run the federal government, to have your finger on the nuclear button. Doesn't experience matter?
Yeah. Well, let's look at what those experienced people have done for us. Look at all those experienced people who took us into Iraq. Look at all those experienced people who kept us in Afghanistan 20 years too long. Look at all those experienced people who have not raised them.
I agree with you, but also look at Donald Trump.
And I am in this candidacy saying what everybody knows. This society is rigged at this point. We have already moved into the area of oligarchy, whether it's oil companies or defense contractors, insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies. They run this country, Mehdi, and you know it. I've heard.
Marianne's positions on lots of issues that Americans really care about and that really affect our lives are pretty jaw-dropping. And that's not because these positions are so radical and extreme. In most cases, it's because they make so much sense. So that's all pretty interesting, but what does this have to do with animals in particular? Williamson has been outspoken about the need to end factory farming. Not regulate it, not do a better job taking care of the animals, but end it. Whereas the Democrats have been mostly silent on this, despite their rhetoric on climate. You can't meaningfully discuss climate without addressing the elephant in the room of animal agriculture. Now, Democrats are perceived as more pro-animal, as well as more pro-environment and climate. But this omission is a smoking gun as to their real constraints and their real priorities, which are their donors. In fact, the Biden administration recently sided with the animal ag industry in challenging California's Prop 12 in the Supreme Court. Despite the fact that Marianne Williamson has a unabashedly pro-animal, pro-climate, anti-factory farming agenda that she's very vocal about, she's not currently vegan. Now, even though Marianne Williamson's positions are unambiguously more progressive on animal rights than that of any candidate that we've seen in a mainstream presidential election, her actual position on veganism is interesting because it reflects something that is very common in terms of how Americans think about animal rights and these issues. Marianne's interview recently on MSNBC really highlights the fact that Marianne is running on a foundational principle that the American people should get to make up their minds about their president based on policies, not entitlement and attachment to the status quo and other forms of political gobbledygook. Now, is she really a fringe candidate, or is she just in line with the values and wishes of the American people? Whether or not either party actually takes us seriously in that regard. Whether Williamson secures the nomination or not, and the DNC is pulling out all the stops to prevent it, such as by choosing not to hold primary debates, which is a vastly popular decision across the aisle, she's shifting the Overton window, both in terms of what can be said, what can happen when someone stands up to business as usual and goes off script, speaking directly to voters, and elevating how critical, monumentous, and popular factory farming bans and similar initiatives could be.